So this is where it all started.
Yeah, this is Hideaway Bay became. Grandpa came paddling, I guess, paddling in from the Big Fork River and, up Deer Creek and made his way around North Bay and Squaw Bay and then came into this big bay with a huge sand beach, and it caught his eye. He was actually looking for a place to be an outpost for trapping in the spring and fall and winter. And if you look now at the shore, you'll see where the old lodge was, right where that pontoon boat is right behind that was the old original lodge, about 60 feet long, about 30 feet wide, windows all around it, and it became the place where they served food, had dances, and fed the fishermen, hunters. There's in about 1949, 48, the snow caved it in, and so they had to rebuild. So that was the end of it. They tore it down, and a lot of the material became what we call the old lodge at the other end that you'll see.
So where did Charlie come from?
Well, he originally was born in Mackinac City, Michigan. That's the Straits of Mackinac between Upper and Lower Michigan. Little town Mackinac City.
And he came to this area to trap?
Yeah, he was an outdoorsman. He loved to trap. He had done some of that in Michigan. And he worked through Wisconsin and knew this was more wilderness. This was kind of the last frontier for logging and trapping. So that's what pulled him here in about, I'm not sure exactly, but I would say about 1906 or 7. Worked for some of the logging camps over north of Deer River on Spring Lake, carried ties to build the tracks, and then he did a little logging with them too, and he would trap in between.
How about Viga?
Viga came from
His
Chicago.
wife, your grandmother.
Viga Minerva.
Viga Minerva.
Johnson, Swedish. And she and her sister Alpha came in about 1911 to, she and her sister Alpha left at the age of 17. Their dad, Oscar Johnson, thought Chicago was getting too rough for young girls. He was a bricklayer, a foreman, and so he put them on the train. He heard that they needed women for cooking and so forth up in northern Minnesota, and he thought that's probably where to send them. So they came in about 1911, and that's where she met Charlie, who was working right there in one of the camps. Anyway, that was the start of their
And your mother, Lorraine, was their first child.
Right. She was born in 1912. They spent their winters there then from 1912 till about 1920 in what they call the Summit. It was just a tar paper shack about a mile off from the grade, the railroad grade, where Grandma Viga's oldest sister, Vida, and her husband came in from Chicago and built a general store. Adolph Hyde, his name was, and he thought it would be a great place to, he was kind of an entrepreneur, and thought a general store for the camps, trappers, loggers would be a great place, and it was. They did well there. They built a little tavern after that onto it, but it basically was a general store. So that was the start. They didn't move here till about 1918, 1919.
And then
So my mother, Lorraine, then spent most of her time with the Hydes and the Cuttings.
so your mother, Lorraine, used to what? Travel by canoe? There was no road access,
No
right?
road, no. Number one that runs from Effie toward Togo was built in 1927. So that time from 1918 to 27, there were no roads in here. So Grandpa Charlie would pick up eventually when they started the resort, 1921. He'd pick up the guests that were hauled from they'd go by railroad, the guests from the big cities, Chicago, St. Louis, so forth, all the way to Effie they called it the gut and liver line. And then Grandpa would meet them, and eventually they had a road to what they call Five Corners, and then they would go by horse to Panette Lake. Panette Lake connected Deer Creek, and then he'd take the boat from Panette Lake all the way to Deer Creek, and all the way he'd row, which is probably 3.5 miles each way.
I feel like you remember wigwams.
Yes, we even have some photos of old wigwams that were on the beach, right in this area, just the frames, where the Indians had come from Nut Lake. There was a trail that came right down between these hills right here, and they would net tullibees and dry them here, and they also would, shoot ducks and so forth. And I don't know if they spent winters here too. Some probably did, but it's about 15 miles that path to Net Lake, where there is still a big reservation, Net Lake Reservation. So this was an Indian encampment at some point.
When did Grandpa Charlie, start Hideaway as a resort?
1921. He got the idea after World War I. Tourism really took hold. People wanted to get out, wanted to recreate, and one of his first customers was Andy Tribble from Kansas City, Missouri. And he was really an important part of this resort because he got many big name people, people with money, so forth, that ended up coming here. And of course, they only had a couple cabins to start with. They ended up with 5, I think. But basically, they'd board here. Grandma would do all the cooking for them. Some important people that most people have heard of would be the Mayo brothers. Charlie Mayo would come and spend 2 to 3 weeks with Grandpa in the summer and fall, hunting and fishing. Not 3 weeks at a time, but he'd come for a week and then go back, come. Joe Brooks, who was the editor of Outdoor Life for many years, 20 years, I think, did the same thing. He'd come up here and spend time with Grandpa. They'd fish, hunt, so forth. But Andy Tribble was the guy that got so many coming from, the big cities. He was in real estate and in the military too, so he had contacts there. General Burton, who was the top general for the Air Force in World War I, and even into World War II, would come here too. We have photos of them sitting around the kitchen table and dining room table, eating with Grandpa and Grandma and the family, Lawrence, Sonny, and Bevy. Of course, my mother then was long gone. She had gotten married. That's a whole nother story. That she went to Deer River High School, and they'd stay in dorms there. So that's where she did her high school, and her grade school she did in Spring Lake with the Hides and that I mentioned before. Mainly a big bunch of cousins, about 14 cousins, I think. But then she would spend her winters when she got through. She went through 10th grade, and when she was 16, I believe, she went to Chicago, where all Grandma Viga's relatives were, and she was a nanny for a couple years with Aunt Violet and Uncle Eddie. Uncle Eddie owned a big theater in downtown Chicago. So my mother picked up, she said, a lot of polishing points that many people don't get by being an Annie with them, because they had money, they had a lot of contacts, and so she learned a lot. She was quite proud of that. She'd go to church with them too, and so forth. But then she'd come back and spend her summers here from the time she was 17. And so she after being a nanny, going back to that, she then worked for about 2 or 3 more years for Montgomery Ward in Chicago. And she was a host dance instructor at the Aragon Ballroom in Chicago, where she would, the hosts would be dance partners for many of the people that came in that didn't know how to dance probably too well, and they would help them learn to dance and be partners, and that's where I got interested in Wayne King. Wayne King was the big band at the Aragon for years. Eddie Howard later, but Wayne King played the saxophone, so that's how I got interested. And, there was always a lot of music. My dad, of course, was real musical, and she met him, Myron Carlson, in the CC camp right across the lake. He came in 1934, and you can see the highest hills over there. That's where the CC camp, S95, was built, 1934 to, I think, 45. So he spent about a year there. In 1936, they got married. And I was born in 1938.
So back to Hideaway, when Viga and Charlie had it, then one year it didn't make it through the winter, a snow,
Well,
or
there
then
was a lapse there. Dad had to go into the service. He was older than most. He was 32 or 3 when he went into the service. But in the meantime, when they got married, they built a little house. Evergreen Inn became Evergreen Inn Resort later, but they built just a 2-room house, and Dad built a dance hall, a big dance hall, about, again, 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, right on Pickerel Lake, which is right behind Deer Lake to the east, southeast. They spent their time there with the tavern, getting things going, and when he had to go in the service, then he had just gotten interested. There was a building over at another resort on the west side of the lake called Deer Acres, or Katina's Lodge, and they were selling one little annex of their big lodge. It was called the Liar's Den. It's where the guests would go after they fished and hunted and sit there and tell stories. He bought it. It was up for sale. He bought it, pulled it across on the ice in about 1940, I think, or 39, and pulled it down to where it remained on number 1 in our County Road 533. And Grandpa Charlie and Grandma Viga then ran it for him. And that's when they were living down there, that's when it caved in here. And at that time, Chuck, or Charlie the second, their oldest son, had been in the service too, paratrooper. He got out, and Grandpa Charlie sold Hideaway to him and Mary Blackmore.
What year was
wife.
that?
Well, I would guess, but about 1944, I think. So when he came out of the service, he went right to Hideaway Inn, and they took over the resort.
So they had it almost 20 years, and then you bought it from your Uncle Chuck.
Then we bought it in 1963. So, yeah, that long. And like we said, they when it caved in, they had to hurry up and get another place. So they used a lot of the same materials, not the logs, but all the dimensional infrastructure and all the doors and windows. There were many, many windows. It was all windows all the way around it. They saved those and built. You can see a little bit of it. The corner of it where that last stock is, that's the old lodge. We rent it now. It's 4-bedroom, 2-bath, and it's 25 feet from the water's edge. It's just a beautiful spot for.
Well, and that's where we grew up as kids.
Right.
And
we
loved
bought
it.
In '63, Gretchen and Angie. We had those two little girls. Gretch was one, and Angie was three. So they had an early start here too. But that was our start. So we've had it 57 years now.
And tell us about it being the...
Well, it was named the oldest functional resort, operating resort in Itasca County under one family bloodline, which would have been Viga and Charlie, Chuck and Mary, and then our family. So that was kind of fun. They did an article in the Grand Rapids paper, and so it got a little press.